This is Afternoons with Sonya.
On 891 ABC Adelaide.
Well, are you a good speller or a bad speller? There is definitely a range out there, and can you change from being a bad speller into a good speller? Lyn Stone certainly thinks you can, and she has developed a whole teaching method associated with what she calls spelling for life. Her new book is aimed specifically at teachers, but what can we learn from it ourselves? Lyn Stone, author and clinical director of Linguist Learning in Victoria. Lyn, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sonya.
What makes someone a good speller or a bad speller?
That's a great question, actually. There are definitely people who are born with the sort of brain that takes on spelling with ease, and there are others that find it a struggle. So being a good speller has something to do with your visual memory, has something to do with lots and lots of things sort of along your developmental journey, if you like. And yes, there will always be people who just can spell, and there will be people who struggle. But my contention is that you can always spell better, and even the ones who are natural gifted spellers can improve, and that's what I'm trying to sort of bring to light.
Lyn, it seems to me, and I wouldn't classify myself as a bad speller, but there are so many exceptions to rules that how do you develop any sort of knowledge of what that is without actually just knowing how to spell individual words?
Well, it sounds extreme, but I would start with love. I love the exceptions. And when I'm teaching children and adults, I work with a lot of adults too, but when I'm teaching, I actually give points and prizes and a lot of praise for finding exceptions. Because what you find, once you scratch the surface of exceptional words, for instance, you find that actually they belong to categories that are governed by rules, just like the really obvious rules, like the letter B says B. Well, there are lots and lots of rules to do with the exceptions as well. And you'll find that exceptions fall into about 7 distinct categories as to why they're exceptional, and they fall into families of other words that are exceptional in the same way. And then what you see when you look at that and you analyze that, you'll find that up to 95% of the words that we deal with in English are in fact rule-based and not difficult at all once you scratch that surface.
In fact, you sort of talk about spelling as being very much like maths or science.
Yeah, I do.
I bet that causes a bit of controversy.
Oh, I'm pilloried for it, but only temporarily. Say I take a room of teachers. I do workshops for teachers, and say I have a room of them, and they've all been forced to come to my workshop, and some of them are there and they love it because they're, really into spelling, and some of them are the PE teacher, the science teacher, or the maths teacher, and they hate me. So I walk in and say, spelling is actually scientific, and it's actually mathematical. It's pattern-based, it's rule-based, and it can be, proper responses to spelling problems can be derived through the scientific method. Well, at first they don't like that at all, but they spend the day with me, and I find that they're usually my most fervent, passionate converts by the end of the day. So it's just a case of showing repeatedly how these patterns exist and what to do with them.
So let's be clear then. You're saying that even in the exceptions, there are patterns.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I do say is in spelling errors, there are patterns. So yes, there are. When you take a word and you think, I just learned a rule about that word, and this word breaks that rule, and at this point, most people give up. They just say, look, I'm confounded. I cannot move on. When you actually show that word belongs in a family and it is exceptional for a reason, suddenly it just gets a little bit more easy to approach that word.
So let's do something, I guess, that most people would know. I before E, except after C.
That's the solitary spelling rule. Just about everybody in the Anglophone, the English-speaking world knows that rule. And it's brilliant. It's an excellent rule, but it definitely needs expansion. It's a great rule of thumb, but it works.
It doesn't cover everything.
Yeah, it works about 65% of the time, which is still a majority. That's great. Start there. And I do always say, start with the simple, move on to the complex, because we are talking about our language, and our language reflects the inner workings of our mind. So it's bound to have its complexities. So I before E, except after C is a wonderful rule, but I written a chapter about that in my book, about I before E expanded. And so there are other things that you should know. And if they're explicitly taught, it becomes less confounding.
So you're not teaching people how to spell words. You're teaching them all the different rules. Is that right?
That's exactly it. And I'm teaching them an approach to the rules that make it logical. You start with the simple rules, and you get good at those, and you can then move on to the more complex rules.
Grant's given us a ring from Valley View. Hello, Grant.
How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you.
I was just thinking that, we talk about exceptions, but perhaps there are no exceptions, because if you look at the nature of English, what makes it, I suppose, so far-reaching, is that it's an amalgam. It's like a sponge that soaked up so many words from so many different languages over, this huge thousands or 1,000-odd years, and that's, what we see as exceptions is just that, incredible variety. And I just find it fascinating to look back at where words have come from. So perhaps we look at it in the wrong way.
Grant, let's put that to Lyn Stone. She's the author and clinical director of Linguist Learning in Victoria, the author of this book, Spelling for Life. Lyn?
Yes, history is very, very important. And luckily in schools, we do quite a bit of etymology, which is looking at word origins. Although I think there has been a little bit of a lack of dictionary work. It's very, very important to teach children to use dictionaries via whatever media you have now, paper dictionaries as well as online dictionaries. But looking at the origin of a word is incredibly important with the spelling of a word. I have adults actually coming to me now saying, because I have a challenge going on where I'm challenging people to learn 50 words. In 1 year, 50 tricky words. And I have a good friend of mine who's just come out of the closet as being a terrible speller, even though she's a highly academic, very intelligent person. And she texts me with her difficult word of the day. And I find as soon as I explain the origin, she gets it. And nobody ever explained that to her before. Nobody highlighted the fact that this is really, really important and useful. And she can generalize that, so she can look at other words in that word's family and get them all.
Lyn, so how many rules would there be that you need to learn to improve your spelling technique?
That's another great question. What we have, I think we have a tier. It's like a pyramid. And at the very top of the pyramid is that solitary I before E rule that everybody knows. Then you've got slightly deeper structure rules, which number about 30. And those are things like the letter Q is written with the letter U. And those are things like the letter C and the letter G are affected by certain other letters, and so on. So they're the sort of the deeper structure rules that we all kind of pick up as reasonable spellers along the way, and where to double, that sort of thing. And then there are much deeper structure rules which deal with exceptions and so on, which number, well, you could take a rule and you could go further and further into that rule and look at the exceptions to that rule and why the rule is like it is. So
I'm assuming that some of these difficulties, though, because we say words that are spelt differently in similar fashions, that will also add to the confusion.
I think, and I think research has actually, there's a lot of evidence and studies have shown that if you teach, for instance, a child a word in isolation and teach them how to spell that word in isolation, you will be less successful, or the child will be less successful in learning other words that have that same pattern. If, however, you teach words and words related to that, you'll find that you exponentially increase that child's what's called sight word vocabulary, where they can just spell words like they spell their own names. So, yes, at first, learning, here's the method that we have right now, or that you typically have in a school. You get 10 words on Monday. They're not related to one another at all. They might be related to the subject matter, if you're lucky, that you're studying that week. And then on Friday, you get a spelling test.
Yeah.
Now, my contention is you learn 5 words and you pick the words that you can see that they're related to. So some people might pick the word thought, and then they'll pick another, they'll put that in a group like through and thorough and so on. And yes, at first, that's a lot of learning. But what they've done is they've actually taken care of an exponential amount of words instead of words in isolation.
I'm sure a lot of people would like to know more. The book is called Spelling for Life. You're targeted at teachers, but it looks very clear and easy to read. So I would imagine that if you wanted to take a look at it yourself to become a better speller, it's probably a good thing to do. Thank you for your time, Lyn. Lyn Stone, author and clinical director of Linguist Learning in Victoria.